Dog waited 7 years, and what happened next will leave you in tears. In the small town of Willow Creek, Maine, where winters painted the landscape in shades of white and gray, an unexpected visitor arrived one crisp morning. A golden retriever, his coat weathered but still gleaming under the pale sunlight, took up position in front of an abandoned house on the outskirts of town. The locals didn't know where he came from or why he chose that particular spot. But there was something remarkable about his presence that caught everyone's attention. The dog, whom the townspeople began calling Rusty, wasn't just another stray. His eyes held a determination that spoke of purpose, and his unwavering gaze remained fixed on the road leading into town. Day after day, he maintained his vigil, refusing all attempts to lure him away from his chosen post. Even when kind-hearted residents offered him shelter during storms or tried to coax him into their homes with treats, Rusty would always return to the same spot, as if bound by an invisible tether. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Let us know which city you're watching us from. Stay tuned. As weeks passed, Rusty became something of a local legend. Tourists would drive by just to catch a glimpse of the dog who never gave up, as he came to be known. The mystery deepened when people noticed that Rusty wasn't simply waiting. He was watching, observing, guarding something that only he seemed to understand. The abandoned house behind him had its own story to tell. Once a beautiful Victorian-style home with wraparound porches and intricate woodwork, it now stood as a silent sentinel alongside its canine guardian. The peeling paint and overgrown garden couldn't hide its former grandeur, and somehow, Rusty's presence seemed to bring a spark of life back to the property. 7-year-old Emma Matthews first heard about Rusty during one of her father's historical society meetings. As the local historian, Jonathan Matthews often hosted gatherings where townspeople would discuss Willow Creek's rich past. But the mystery of Rusty captured Emma's imagination like no other story had before. Emma was different from other children her age. While they spent their afternoons playing video games or watching TV, she preferred to accompany her father on his research expeditions around town. Her curious nature and sharp mind made her a natural detective, and something about Rusty's story called to her on a deep level. One autumn afternoon, while the other children were preparing for Halloween, Emma decided to visit Rusty. She packed a small bag with dog treats and her father's old camera, determined to document what she found. As she approached the abandoned house, the golden retriever's eyes met hers, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, or an understanding. Unlike his usual aloofness with visitors, Rusty didn't back away when Emma sat down on the grass near him. He maintained his watchful position, but allowed her to slowly inch closer. Emma noticed that despite his apparent age, Rusty carried himself with dignity, his posture suggesting training and care rather than the life of a stray. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn, Emma noticed something peculiar. Rusty's attention seemed to intensify whenever cars of a certain color, a deep blue, passed by on the road. His ears would perk up, and his body would tense slightly before relaxing again when the vehicle passed. The discovery excited Emma. It wasn't random behavior. Rusty was looking for something specific. She pulled out her notebook, a gift from her father for her amateur investigations, and began taking notes. The way Rusty reacted to certain sounds, his careful observation of passing vehicles, the particular times of day when he seemed most alert, everything could be a clue. As darkness approached and Emma prepared to leave, she made a promise to herself and to Rusty. She would uncover the truth behind his unwavering vigil. There was more to this story than a loyal dog waiting for a lost owner. Much more. Emma could feel it in her bones, the way she felt it when she discovered hidden passages in old buildings with her father, or when she found forgotten photographs in the town archives. What Emma didn't realize as she walked home that evening was that her encounter with Rusty had set in motion a chain of events that would unravel one of Willow Creek's most intriguing mysteries. The abandoned house, the faithful dog, and the secrets they guarded were about to change. Not only her life, but the entire town's understanding of loyalty, perseverance, and the unbreakable bonds that connect hearts across time and distance. The citizens of Willow Creek had grown accustomed to Rusty's presence, But none of them had truly asked why he chose that particular house, that specific spot. None except Emma, who now carried the first piece of a puzzle that would prove far more complex and fascinating than anyone could have imagined. As she disappeared down the street, Rusty watched her go, his eyes holding secrets that would soon begin to unravel, one clue at a time. The following days saw Emma establishing a routine with Rusty. Each afternoon after school, she would make her way to the abandoned house, armed with her investigation kit, a flashlight, her father's old Polaroid camera, and carefully packed treats for her new friend. But unlike other children who might simply play with a dog, Emma approached her visits with the methodical precision she had learned from her father's historical research. On a particularly windy afternoon, as autumn leaves danced across the yard, Emma noticed something she hadn't seen before. While sharing a sandwich with Rusty, she saw how his eyes kept darting to a specific corner of the porch. Following his gaze, she spotted a loose floorboard, partially hidden beneath years of fallen leaves and debris. Her heart racing with excitement, Emma carefully approached the spot. Rusty, breaking his usual stoic posture, followed close behind. The old wood creaked beneath her feet as she knelt down to brush away the leaves. With trembling fingers, she discovered the board wasn't just loose, it was concealing something. "What do we have here, Rusty?" she whispered, reaching into the small space. Her fingers touched something solid, a metal box, its surface cool and rough with rust. As she pulled it out, Rusty's tail began to wag for the first time since she'd known him. The simple gesture confirmed what her instincts had been telling her. This was important. The box, though weathered by time and elements, was still intact. It took Emma several minutes of careful maneuvering to open it, her small fingers working at the clasp, until it finally gave way with a soft click. Inside, protected from the elements, she found a collection of items that made her gasp. Photographs, yellowed with age, but still clear, a tarnished medallion, and what appeared to be children's toys. One photograph in particular caught her attention. It showed a family standing proudly in front of the house, not the abandoned structure it was now, but a beautiful home with fresh paint and well-tended gardens. A couple smiled at the camera, their arms around a small child, and beside them stood a younger Rusty, his golden coat gleaming in the sunlight. Emma's hands shook as she examined the photograph more closely. The family looked happy, normal. Nothing about the image suggested why they would suddenly disappear, or why Rusty would maintain his lonely vigil years later. She turned the photo over and found a date written in faded ink. Summer 2015, the Bradfords, New Beginning. The name triggered a memory. Emma had heard her father mention the Bradfords during one of his historical society meetings. They were relatively new to Willow Creek's long history, having moved to town less than a decade ago, but their sudden disappearance had become part of local legend. As she continued examining the contents of the box, each item seemed to hold its own story. The medallion bore an inscription too worn to read completely, but Emma could make out the words "always" and "promise." Among the toys, she found a small wooden train with intricate carvings and a stuffed elephant that seemed handmade. Rusty watched intently as she catalogued each item in her notebook, his eyes following her movements with an almost human understanding. When she held up the medallion, his ears perked forward, and he let out a soft whine, the first sound she'd heard him make. The sun was setting when Emma carefully returned everything to the box, except for the photograph, which she tucked safely into her notebook. She needed to show this to her father. As a historian, he might be able to help her understand more about the Bradfords and why they left Willow Creek so suddenly. "I'll be back tomorrow, Rusty," she promised, scratching behind his ears. "We're going to figure this out together." As she walked home in the gathering dusk, Emma's mind raced with questions. Why had the Bradfords left so suddenly? What was the significance of the items in the box? And most importantly, what did Rusty know about it all? The medallion's inscription, "always" and "promise," echoed in her thoughts, suggesting a pledge that somehow extended beyond time and absence. At home, Emma found her father in his study, surrounded by old books and town records. Jonathan Matthews looked up from his work, immediately noticing the excitement in his daughter's eyes. Before he could ask about her day, Emma pulled out the photograph and placed it on his desk. The moment Jonathan saw the image, his expression changed. Recognition flickered across his face, followed by something else, concern perhaps, or uncertainty. He picked up the photograph, studying it with the careful attention he usually reserved for his most important historical findings. "Emma," he said finally, his voice careful and measured, "where did you find this?" And in that moment, as Emma began to explain, she realized she had stumbled upon something far more significant than a simple family mystery. The photograph in her father's hands was just the beginning, the first piece in a puzzle that would reveal a story of promises, protection, and unexpected connections that ran deep beneath the surface of their quiet town. Jonathan Matthews spent the next hour examining the photograph while Emma recounted every detail of her discovery. As a historian, he had documented countless stories about Willow Creek's residents, but the Bradfords' tale had always been different, a mystery that seemed to resist explanation. The Bradfords weren't like other families who moved to Willow Creek, Jonathan explained, adjusting his reading glasses. They arrived in the middle of winter, bought that house in cash, and immediately began renovating it. They were private people, but kind. Sarah Bradford, the mother, she used to bake cookies for the entire neighborhood every Sunday. Emma leaned forward in her chair, absorbing every detail. "What happened to them, Dad?" Her father's expression grew thoughtful. "That's the peculiar part. One day, they were here, participating in community events. Their daughter Alice attending the local school, and the next..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. They were gone. No goodbye, no forwarding address. The only trace they left behind was Rusty, Emma finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. Yes, Rusty, though none of us knew that was his name until now. Jonathan stood up and walked to his filing cabinet, pulling out a folder labeled Recent Town History. The interesting thing is, they weren't the only family to leave suddenly that year. The Petersons from the next town over also disappeared around the same time. Emma's eyes widened. "Do you think they're connected?" "I don't know, sweetheart. But I do know one thing, that house you've been visiting. It wasn't just any house. It was once owned by a man named Frederick Wallace, one of Willow Creek's most enigmatic residents. He was known for helping people disappear." "Disappear?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Not in a bad way," Jonathan quickly clarified. "He helped people start new lives when they needed to. During the Underground Railroad, that house served as a safe haven. Even in more recent times, Wallace's descendants maintained the tradition of helping people who needed to escape difficult situations." The revelation made Emma's head spin. She pulled out her notebook, flipping to a clean page, so the Bradfords might have needed help. But from what? Before Jonathan could answer, a knock at the front door startled them both. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Henderson, the town librarian, clutching what appeared to be an old newspaper. "Jonathan," she called out as Emma's father opened the door, "I saw your lights on, and..." "Oh, Emma, you're here too. Good." She stepped inside, unfolding the newspaper with trembling hands. "I've been organizing the library's archives, and I found something you both need to see." The newspaper was dated just weeks before the Bradfords' disappearance. On the front page was a story about a revolutionary new security system being developed by a small tech company. In the accompanying photograph, standing slightly behind the company's CEO, was Mr. Bradford. Robert Bradford wasn't just any software engineer, Mrs. Henderson explained. He was working on something big, something that could change everything about how we protect sensitive information. Emma's father studied the article intently. "A quantum encryption system," he murmured. "Theoretically unbreakable. And worth millions to the right people," Mrs. Henderson added, "or dangerous in the wrong hands." Emma thought about the medallion she'd found, the words always and promise and taking on new meaning. She remembered how Rusty watched the road, particularly alert when certain vehicles passed by. Was he watching for the Bradfords, or was he watching for someone else? "There's more," Mrs. Henderson continued, pulling out a small notebook. "I found Sarah Bradford's library card application, the address she listed before moving to Willow Creek. It doesn't exist. I checked. It's a vacant lot in Portland that's been empty for decades. Jonathan sat down heavily in his armchair. So the Bradfords weren't who they claimed to be even before they arrived here. Emma's mind was racing. Dad, can we go back to the house? There might be more clues we missed. Her father checked his watch, then looked outside at the darkening sky. Tomorrow, sweetheart. First thing in the morning. And this time, I'm coming with you. That night, Emma could hardly sleep. She kept thinking about Rusty, faithfully guarding his post. Was he protecting the house's secrets, warning the Bradfords if anyone came looking for them? The more she learned, the more questions she had. In her dreams, she saw the happy family from the photograph, their faces blurred by the passage of time. She saw Rusty, younger and sprightly, playing with little Alice Bradford in a garden full of flowers. And she saw the house as it must have been, not abandoned and mysterious, but alive with light and laughter, hiding its secrets behind a facade of normal, happy family life. As dawn broke over Willow Creek, Emma was already awake, preparing for another day of investigation. She didn't know it yet, but the box she'd found was just the beginning. The house held more secrets, deeper mysteries, and clues that would lead her and her father down a path neither of them expected. A path that would reveal how far some people would go to protect not just information, but the ones they loved. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with autumn sunlight filtering through the remaining leaves on the trees. Emma and her father arrived at the abandoned house early, finding Rusty already alert at his post. The old dog's tail wagged slightly at Emma's approach, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Jonathan. "He trusts you," Jonathan observed, watching as Rusty allowed Emma to scratch behind his ears. "That's significant. From what I remember, the Bradfords' dog was extremely protective of their family." Emma led her father to the loose floorboard where she'd found the box. Jonathan knelt down, running his hands over the weathered wood. His fingers caught on something, a small, almost invisible seam in the timber. Years of historical research had taught him to notice such details. "Emma, shine your flashlight here," he requested, tracing the seam. As the light illuminated the space, both father and daughter gasped. The seam wasn't random. It formed a perfect rectangle, much larger than the space where Emma had found the box. Working together, they carefully pried up the boards, revealing a hidden compartment underneath. Rusty moved closer, his nose twitching with interest as Jonathan reached inside. The space contained several items: a leather-bound journal, a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon, and most intriguingly, a series of blueprints. "These are the original house plans," Jonathan breathed, carefully unfolding the brittle papers. "Drawn by Frederick Wallace himself." His eyes widened as he studied the diagrams. "Emma, this house isn't just a house. It's a masterpiece of hidden architecture." The blueprints revealed a network of concealed passages and secret rooms, ingeniously integrated into the house's Victorian design. What appeared to be ordinary walls could slide away, revealing escape routes. Bookshelves doubled as doorways, and certain floorboards could be lifted to access hidden storage spaces. "Look at this." Emma pointed to a notation in the corner of one blueprint. The words were faded but clear. "For those who seek sanctuary." Below it was a series of numbers that made no immediate sense. Jonathan pulled out his phone and began taking pictures of the blueprints. These numbers could be important. They might be a code or coordinates. He paused, noticing something else. "Emma, do you see this symbol here? It's repeated throughout the plans." Emma leaned closer. The symbol was small but distinctive. A compass rose with an unusual marking at its center. "It looks like the design on the medallion I found," she realized. Rusty suddenly raised his head, ears perked. A car was approaching, a dark blue sedan, similar to the ones that always caught his attention. As it slowed passing the house, Emma noticed the driver, a woman with silver hair, watching them intently through the window. "Dad," Emma whispered, "who is that?" Jonathan straightened up, recognition flickering across his face. "Margaret Peterson. She used to work at the tech company with Robert Bradford." He waved, but the car had already accelerated away. Turning back to their discovery, they began examining the journal. Most entries were written in what appeared to be code, but some pages contained clear text. One entry caught Emma's eye. "The system isn't just about encryption anymore. Sarah says we've gone too far, knows too much." Alice drew another picture today. She sees things differently. Perhaps she always has. Must protect them. Wallace's legacy may be our only hope. As they read, Rusty moved to the edge of the porch, his posture alert. Emma watched as he pawed at a specific spot on the ground, whining softly. Jonathan joined him, brushing away years of accumulated dirt to reveal a metal handle. "A cellar door," Jonathan murmured, "but it's not on any of the official house plans." Together, they pulled at the handle. The door resisted at first, then slowly creaked open, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. The air that wafted up was cool and surprisingly fresh, suggesting ventilation. Emma shined her flashlight down the stairs. The beam revealed walls lined with old shelving. And at the bottom, something reflected the light back at them. A mirror, positioned at an odd angle. "Dad, look at this." Emma pointed to where the mirror met the wall. "There's something behind it." Before they could investigate further, they heard another car approaching. This time, when Rusty tensed, his reaction was different, more urgent. Jonathan quickly closed the cellar door, covering it with dirt and leaves. "We need to be careful," he told Emma. Gathering their discoveries. Whatever the Bradfords were involved in, whatever made them leave, it's clearly not over. As they prepared to leave, Emma noticed something had changed about Rusty. Though he maintained his vigil, his eyes now held a new purpose. It was as if their discoveries had awakened something in him, a renewed sense of mission. "We'll be back," Emma promised him softly. "There's more to find." "Isn't there?" Rusty's gentle woof seemed to confirm her suspicion. The house had begun to give up its secrets, but Emma sensed they had barely scratched the surface. The hidden cellar, the coded journal, the mysterious Margaret Peterson. Each discovery added new layers to a mystery that seemed to grow deeper with every revelation. Walking home, Emma clutched her notebook tightly. Inside, she had carefully documented everything they'd found, adding her own observations and questions. One thing was becoming clear: the Bradfords hadn't simply disappeared. They had orchestrated their vanishing with careful precision, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs that only the right person could follow. And somehow Emma knew Rusty was the key to it all. The following morning, Emma couldn't focus on her classes. Her mind kept drifting back to the hidden cellar and the oddly positioned mirror. During lunch break, she spread her notes on a library table, reviewing everything they'd discovered. The compass rose symbol from the blueprints particularly intrigued her. She'd seen it somewhere else. She was sure of it. After school, rather than heading directly to the house, Emma convinced her father to stop at the town library. Mrs. Henderson was still cataloguing old records, and her eyes lit up when she saw them. "I was hoping you'd come back," she said, leading them to a back room. "I found something interesting in our archive about Frederick Wallace." She pulled out a dusty photograph album. "Look at this." The album contained photographs of Wallace's family spanning several generations. In one image from the 1960s, a young man stood proudly in front of the house. He wore a pocket watch with a chain, and there, clearly visible, was the compass rose symbol. "That's Frederick Wallace Jr., Mrs. Henderson explained. He continued his father's work of helping people disappear. And look at this." She pointed to a news clipping tucked into the album's pages. He worked for the government in some capacity, though the details were never clear. Emma's father adjusted his glasses, studying the clipping. Interesting. The dates overlap with the Cold War era when many scientists were seeking protection from various agencies. As they discussed the implications, Emma noticed something else in the photograph. A small girl standing in the background, holding what appeared to be the same wooden train she'd found in the box under the porch. "Mrs. Henderson," Emma asked, "did the Wallaces have any connection to the tech company where Mr. Bradford worked?" The librarian's expression changed subtly. "Actually, yes. Margaret Peterson. You remember her? Jonathan. She once mentioned that her grandmother had been helped by the Wallaces during the war." Just then they heard the library door open. Emma turned to see the silver-haired woman from the blue sedan standing in the doorway. Margaret Peterson looked different up close. Tired, but with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. "I thought I might find you here," Margaret said softly. "We need to talk about Robert and Sarah Bradford, and about Alice." They gathered in Mrs. Henderson's office. Away from curious ears, Margaret pulled out an old flash drive from her purse. "Robert wasn't just developing encryption software," she explained. "He discovered something unexpected. A pattern in quantum data that suggested consciousness could affect encryption outcomes. Alice, their daughter, she had an unusual gift. She could see patterns that others couldn't." Emma thought about the journal entry they'd found. "Alice drew another picture today. She sees things differently." "The company wanted to use Alice's ability," Margaret continued. "They didn't care that she was just a child. That's when Robert and Sarah contacted the Wallace Foundation." "The Wallace Foundation," Jonathan leaned forward. "A secret organization continuing Frederick Wallace's work. They help protect people with unique abilities from those who might exploit them." Margaret's voice dropped lower. "The house isn't just architecturally unique. It's designed to shield certain types of energy patterns. That's why they chose it." Emma's mind was racing. "The mirror in the cellar?" Margaret nodded. "It's not just a mirror. It's part of a sophisticated system designed to detect and redirect quantum patterns. Alice could use it to send messages. Messages that only someone with her particular ability could read." "And Rusty?" Emma asked. "Rusty was specially trained. He can sense certain energy patterns too. He's not just guarding the house, he's monitoring it, waiting for a signal." As if on cue, thunder rumbled outside. Emma rushed to the window. Storm clouds had gathered suddenly, unusually dark for the time of day. Lightning flickered, and for a moment, Emma thought she saw patterns in the flashes, like a code written in light. "We need to get to the house," Margaret said urgently. "Now. The storm will interfere with surveillance systems. It's the perfect cover." They hurried to their cars, rain beginning to fall in heavy sheets. When they arrived at the house, Rusty was already at the cellar door, pawing frantically at the ground. The old dog's behavior had completely changed. Gone was his usual stoic vigilance, replaced by urgent purpose. Together, they opened the cellar door and descended the stairs. The mirror gleamed in their flashlight beams, and now Emma could see what she'd missed before, tiny etchings around its frame, forming the same compass rose pattern from the blueprints. Margaret approached the mirror, pulling out a small device from her pocket. "Alice designed this," she explained. "It can decode the quantum patterns, but only during an electrical storm. We've been waiting months for the right conditions." As lightning flashed above, the mirror's surface began to shimmer, not reflecting but transforming, showing patterns and symbols that seemed to move and change with each thunderclap. Rusty sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the display, while Emma quickly sketched the patterns in her notebook. What they saw in that basement would change everything they thought they knew about the Bradfords, about Willow Creek, and about the true purpose of Frederick Wallace's legacy. But as the storm intensified and the patterns grew clearer, they realized they weren't the only ones who had been waiting for this moment. Through the rain-streaked cellar windows, Emma spotted another car pulling up to the house, one that made Rusty growl for the first time since she'd known him. The approaching car's headlights cut through the rain, casting long shadows through the cellar windows. Margaret quickly pulled something from her pocket, a small device that looked like a remote control. With practiced movements, she pressed a sequence of buttons, and suddenly, the cellar entrance above them silently slid shut, blending perfectly with the ground. "Tech from Robert's lab," she whispered, noticing Emma's amazed expression. "The house has several defense systems. The Wallaces thought of everything." Rusty's growl subsided to a low rumble as footsteps crunched on the gravel above. Through the gentle hum of Margaret's device, they could hear voices, at least 3 people, speaking in hushed tones. "Corporate security," Margaret explained softly. "They've been monitoring weather patterns, waiting for a storm like this. They know about the quantum signatures, but don't understand how to read them. That's why they need Alice," Emma finished, understanding dawning in her eyes. The mirror's surface continued to shift and change with each lightning strike, creating patterns that Emma frantically copied into her notebook. Some resembled the drawings they'd found in the box, the ones Alice had made before disappearing. Jonathan studied the patterns, his historian's mind making connections. "These aren't random," he whispered. "They're coordinates, aren't they? But encoded in a way that only someone with Alice's gift could fully understand." Margaret nodded. The quantum encryption system Robert developed wasn't just for data protection. It was a communication method, using the natural quantum fluctuations that occur during electrical storms. Alice discovered she could see these patterns, interpret them. The company wanted to use her ability to create unbreakable codes, but Robert and Sarah refused to let them exploit their daughter. Above them, the footsteps circled the house. Rain drummed against the cellar windows, creating a curtain of water that distorted the view of the outside world. Emma noticed that Rusty had positioned himself directly under one of the windows, his posture alert but calm. He'd clearly done this before. Mrs. Henderson, who had been quietly observing, suddenly gasped. "The library records," she said. All those times Sarah Bradford checked out books about weather patterns and quantum physics. She wasn't just researching, she was learning how to use the storms. Emma's attention was drawn back to the mirror as a particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the cellar. The patterns had changed, becoming more organized, almost like letters. She quickly sketched them, her hand moving almost of its own accord. "Wait," she said, looking at what she'd drawn. "These aren't just coordinates. Look at how they're arranged. It's like a music sheet." Margaret's eyes widened. "Of course, Alice played the piano. Sarah used to say that her daughter saw music in everything, in rain patterns, in sunlight through leaves, in the way birds flew." She wasn't speaking metaphorically. Jonathan pulled out the old journal they'd found, flipping through its pages with renewed purpose. "Here," he pointed to an entry. "Listen to this. Alice says the quantum patterns sound like her favorite lullaby. We'll use that. They'll never think to look for messages in a child's song." The footsteps above had stopped. In the relative quiet, broken only by thunder and rain, Emma could almost hear it, a faint melody, somehow emanating from the patterns in the mirror. Rusty's ears perked up, and his tail began to wag slowly. Margaret's device beeped softly. "Are the storm's reaching its peak?" she whispered. "If there's a message coming, it will be now." As if in response, the mirror's surface erupted in a cascade of shifting patterns. Emma's hand moved across her notebook, capturing every detail. The corporate security team above might have their sophisticated equipment, but they didn't have what mattered most, the ability to see the world through Alice's eyes. Suddenly, Rusty stood up, his attention fixed on something beyond the cellar walls. A new sound had joined the storm, a melody played on piano keys, so faint it might have been imagination, but Emma recognized it. The same tune she'd begun to understand in the mirror's patterns. Margaret's face lit up with recognition. "That's the signal we've been waiting for," she whispered. "Alice is reaching out. She's letting us know they're safe. And..." She paused, studying the patterns Emma had recorded. "There's more. She's giving us instructions." The piano notes continued, barely audible above the storm, yet carrying a message that only those in the cellar could truly understand. As Emma compared her sketches to the musical notes, a clear pattern emerged, one that would lead them to the next piece of the puzzle, and perhaps to understanding why the Bradfords had chosen Willow Creek for their sanctuary. But first, they had to wait out the storm, and the people above who had no idea that the real message they sought was being transmitted not through advanced technology, but through the simple, beautiful medium of a child's lullaby, played on quantum strings that only Alice could see. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cellar, Emma felt as though time had slowed down. She studied the patterns she'd drawn, humming the faint melody softly to herself. The musical notes seemed to align perfectly with the quantum signatures in her sketches, creating a code that was both brilliantly complex and elegantly simple. "Look at this," she whispered, showing her notebook to Margaret. "If we treat each pattern as a musical note and then arrange them according to the lullaby..." Margaret's eyes widened in understanding. "It's a map," she breathed, "not of physical locations, but of quantum nodes, places where the energy patterns Alice can see are strongest." She pulled out her device again, inputting the sequence Emma had decoded. There's a network of these locations across the country. The Wallaces didn't just build this house, they identified and connected these natural quantum hotspots. Jonathan Wood, who had been keeping watch through a small gap in the cellar window, turned to them. "Ice, the security team is moving to the back of the house," he reported quietly. "They're setting up some kind of equipment." Mrs. Henderson had been silent for a while, lost in thought. Now she spoke up, her voice trembling with excitement. "The library's music room," she said. "Sarah Bradford used to take Alice there every Wednesday afternoon. They always requested the old Steinway piano, said it had the perfect tone. But what if they weren't just practicing music?" "The library," Emma repeated, a sudden realization hitting her. "Dad, remember those weird marks on the piano's soundboard, the ones that look like scratches but form patterns?" "Quantum receivers," Margaret explained. "Robert modified several pianos in town. Each one can pick up and transmit the energy patterns, but only when played in exactly the right way. That's why they needed Alice. Her gift allows her to both see the patterns and create them through music." Rusty, who had been standing guard near the window, suddenly pricked up his ears. The piano melody had changed, becoming more complex. Emma quickly noted down the new sequence of notes, her hand moving almost automatically across the page. "It's coordinates," she said, excitement building in her voice. "But not for a place, for a time. Look at how the patterns repeat. They're showing us when and where the next transmission will happen." Margaret studied Emma's notes with growing amazement. "You can see them too, can't you?" she asked softly. "Not as clearly as Alice, perhaps, but you have a similar sensitivity to the patterns." Emma had never thought about it that way, but suddenly many things made sense. Her unusual ability to solve puzzles, the way she sometimes saw connections that others missed. How music often seemed to paint pictures in her mind. A loud crack of thunder made them all jump. Through the cellar window, they could see the security team's equipment sparking and smoking in the rain. "Their instruments can't handle the quantum feedback," Margaret explained with a slight smile. "They're looking for conventional signals, radio waves, digital transmissions. But Alice's messages exist in a different realm entirely." Jonathan checked his watch. "The storm's moving east. We probably have less than 10 minutes before it passes." Emma looked at her notebook again, understanding flowing through her like electricity. "The next transmission will be at the library," she said confidently. "But not in the music room, somewhere else. These patterns, when you arrange them differently." She hummed a few bars of the lullaby, watching the sketched patterns seem to dance on the page. "They point to the old archives." "In the basement," Mrs. Henderson gasped softly. "The archives have remained sealed since the renovation last year. No one's been down there except—" She paused, realization dawning. "Except Sarah Bradford, who volunteered to help catalogue the oldest records." Margaret's device emitted a soft tone. "The quantum signatures are fading with the storm," she reported, "but we got what we needed." She turned to Emma with a serious expression. "The next part is crucial. The security team will figure out they're looking in the wrong place eventually. We need to reach the library archives before they do." Rusty had moved to the cellar stairs, his posture indicating it was safe to leave. The security team's voices were now distant, their attention focused on their malfunctioning equipment. As they prepared to make their exit, Emma noticed something else in her notebook, a pattern she had drawn unconsciously while listening to the lullaby. It looked like the compass rose symbol, but with subtle differences. Inside the central circle, she had sketched what appeared to be musical notes arranged in a spiral. "That's it," Margaret whispered, looking over Emma's shoulder. "That's the key to accessing the archive's quantum node. Alice has given us everything we need." She squeezed Emma's shoulder gently. "You really are remarkable, you know. It's no coincidence that Rusty chose to trust you." Together, they carefully made their way out of the cellar, using the storm's cover to slip away unnoticed. As they drove toward the library, Emma couldn't help but feel that they were racing not just against the security team, but against time itself. Somewhere out there, Alice Bradford was waiting for them to solve this puzzle, to understand the true purpose of her family's disappearance. And somehow, Emma knew, the old Steinway piano in the library held more secrets than anyone had imagined. Secrets that could only be unlocked by understanding the delicate intersection of music, quantum physics, and the extraordinary gift that allowed a young girl to see patterns in the very fabric of reality itself. The library stood dark and imposing against the stormy sky as they arrived. Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the side entrance, using a route that would keep them away from the building's security cameras. The power had gone out during the storm, leaving them to navigate by flashlight through the silent stacks of books. The archive entrance was relocated during the renovation, Mrs. Henderson whispered as they descended a narrow staircase. But Sarah Bradford insisted on maintaining access to the old entrance too. She said it was for historical preservation. Emma's flashlight beam caught the gleam of the Steinway piano as they passed the music room. She paused, drawn to the instrument. Walking over, she carefully lifted the lid, revealing the intricate patterns carved into the soundboard, patterns that now seemed to pulse with subtle energy in her vision. "Those aren't just decorative markings," Margaret explained softly. "They're quantum resonators. The whole piano is essentially a sophisticated antenna designed to pick up and amplify the energy patterns Alice could see." Rusty, who had been leading their way through the darkness, suddenly stopped at a seemingly solid wall near the old card catalogue. He pressed his nose against a specific spot, and Emma noticed something, a nearly invisible seam in the woodwork, forming the now familiar compass rose pattern. "Here," Emma said, consulting her notebook. She hummed the lullaby softly, watching how the patterns she'd drawn seemed to align with different points around the compass rose. Following her intuition, she pressed specific points in sequence with the melody. A soft click echoed through the quiet library, and a section of the wall silently swung inward, revealing a narrow passage. Cool air drifted out, carrying the scent of old books and something else, a subtle electrical charge that made the hair on Emma's arms stand up. "The quantum node must be active," Margaret whispered, checking her device. "The storm's energy is still feeding it." They made their way down a narrow spiral staircase, emerging into a circular room that took their breath away. The walls were lined with what looked like ordinary bookshelves, but Emma could see that each book spine contained the same intricate patterns they'd found on the piano's soundboard. In the center of the room stood an antique reading desk, its surface inlaid with brass and copper in designs that matched Emma's sketches. "It's a quantum library," Margaret breathed. The Bradfords didn't just create a communication system, they built an entire network for storing and transmitting information through quantum patterns. Information that only someone with Alice's gift could access. Jonathan examined the desk closely. "These patterns, they're not just decorative, they're moving." He was right. In the beam of their flashlights, the metallic inlays seemed to shift and flow, responding to some unseen energy. Emma approached the desk, her notebook open to the pages where she'd recorded the patterns from the mirror. As she got closer, the designs began to align with her sketches, like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Rusty padded over to a specific bookshelf, pouring gently at a volume bound in deep blue leather. Emma carefully pulled it out, finding that it opened to reveal not pages, but a series of thin crystal sheets, etched with more quantum patterns. "Sarah Bradford's research journal," Mrs. Henderson said, recognizing the book. "She spent hours down here, supposedly organizing old records, but she was actually creating a quantum database," Margaret finished. "Information stored not in words or digital code, but in patterns of energy that exist between normal matter, patterns that Alice could read as easily as we read words on a page." Emma placed the crystal sheets on the reading desk, and suddenly the room came alive with soft, shimmering light. The patterns from her notebook began to glow on the page, resonating with the designs on the desk. And then, impossibly, music began to play. Not from any visible source, but seemingly from the patterns themselves. It was Alice's lullaby, but now Emma could hear it properly for the first time. The melody carried more than just notes. It carried information, encoded in the very structure of the sound waves. As she listened, images began to form in her mind, coordinates, dates, and most importantly, a message. "They're safe," Emma said suddenly, the words coming to her as clearly as if Alice herself was speaking them. "The Bradfords found other people like Alice, children with the same gift. They're building something together, something important." Margaret nodded. A new kind of network, one that can't be hacked or intercepted because it exists in a realm that most people can't even perceive. A distant noise made them all freeze. Footsteps above. The beam of a flashlight sweeping across the main library floor. "The security team," Jonathan whispered. "They must have followed us." But Emma wasn't worried. She understood now why Alice had led them here, why the message had to be received in this specific place. She turned to a blank page in her notebook and began to draw, her hand moving with confident purpose. The quantum patterns around them responded, shifting and realigning according to her will. "Alice knew," Emma said softly. "She knew I could help protect their secret, just like Rusty has been protecting it all along. But we need to act fast. There's something else we need to find before they get down here." The lullaby continued to play, its quantum-encoded melody guiding Emma toward the final piece of the puzzle, and toward a truth about herself that would change everything she thought she knew about her own abilities. Emma's hands moved swiftly across her notebook pages as footsteps echoed above them. The quantum patterns surrounding them pulsed in sync with her drawings, creating a cascading effect throughout the circular room. Rusty stood alert, but calm, his eyes fixed on Emma as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. "Emma," Margaret whispered urgently, "what do you see?" "It's not just what I see," Emma replied, her voice filled with wonder. "It's what Alice has been trying to tell us all along. The quantum network isn't just for communication, it's a shield." Her pencil traced complex patterns across the page. Every book in this room, every pattern on that desk, they're all part of a massive quantum defense system. Jonathan watched in amazement as the metallic inlays on the reading desk began to respond to Emma's drawings, creating ripples of energy that spread outward through the room. To it, the Bradfords didn't just disappear, and he realized. They integrated themselves into the quantum field somehow. Mrs. Henderson pulled another blue-bound volume from the shelf. "These aren't just books, they're nodes in the network. Sarah spent months setting this up, hiding it in plain sight." She opened the book, revealing more crystal sheets. Each one contains part of the quantum signature that protects their location. The footsteps above grew closer to the hidden entrance. Emma could hear voices now, the security team methodically searching the library, but instead of fear, she felt a strange sense of calm. Her hand continued to move across the page, guided by an understanding that seemed to flow directly from the quantum patterns surrounding them. "Alice knew about my ability," Emma said softly. "That's why Rusty stayed. He wasn't just guarding the house, he was waiting for someone who could see the patterns like she could." She looked up at Margaret. "But I'm different from Alice, aren't I? She could see the patterns naturally, but You're a bridge," Margaret explained, watching the energy patterns respond to Emma's presence. "Where Alice could see and create quantum patterns instinctively, you can learn to understand and translate them. That's even rarer than Alice's gift, and just as valuable." A metallic scraping sound from above indicated the security team was getting close to discovering the hidden entrance. Emma finished her drawing with a flourish, and suddenly, the quantum patterns in the room shifted dramatically. The crystal sheets on the reading desk began to glow with an inner light, their patterns aligning with Emma's sketches. "It's a key," Emma breathed, understanding flowing through her. "Alice left us a quantum key, split across multiple locations. The house, the piano, this library, they're all connected, but it only works if someone can see how the patterns fit together." Rusty padded over to another shelf, nudging a specific spot with his nose. Emma reached up and found a small compartment hidden behind the books. Inside was a simple wooden box, similar to the one they'd found at the house. But this one contained a single crystal sheet and what looked like an old-fashioned pocket watch. "The final piece," Margaret whispered, examining the watch. "Robert Bradford's quantum transmitter, disguised as an antique. With this, we can send a signal through the network. Let them know we've found it." The security team's voices were just outside the hidden door now. Emma could hear them discussing energy readings, trying to locate the source of the quantum signatures their equipment had detected, but she knew they were already too late. With trembling fingers, Emma opened the pocket watch. Inside, instead of clock faces, she found concentric rings of quantum resonators, their patterns matching perfectly with her drawings. As she held it, The watch began to hum softly, responding to the energy patterns filling the room. "Mrs. Henderson," Emma said quietly, "do you still have the key to the old music room?" The librarian nodded, pulling a ring of keys from her pocket. "Good, because we're going to need the Steinway for this next part." Emma turned to Margaret. "Alice didn't just leave us a message, she left us instructions. The quantum shield isn't complete yet, it needs one more thing. A song played on a very specific piano, by someone who can see the patterns in the music." Jonathan looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. "You know the security team will hear it." Emma smiled, a confident gleam in her eye. "That's exactly what we want, because when they do, they'll finally understand why they can never capture what they're looking for. Some things aren't meant to be controlled or contained. They're meant to be felt, understood, and set free." Rusty's tail began to wag as Emma gathered her notebook and the pocket watch. The quantum patterns in the room swirled around them like a gentle breeze, and in that moment, Emma knew exactly what she needed to do. The security team might have their advanced technology and corporate backing, but they didn't have what mattered most: the ability to understand that true protection comes not from controlling power, but from letting it flow naturally through the bonds between people who trust each other. As they prepared to make their move, Emma felt Alice's presence in the quantum patterns more strongly than ever. The next few minutes would change everything, not just for the Bradfords, but for everyone who had ever believed in the power of seeing the world differently. The journey to the music room felt like walking through a dream. Emma led the way, Rusty at her side, while the others followed closely behind. The security team's flashlight beams danced through the library's main floor, but Emma knew exactly how to avoid them, guided by the quantum patterns that now seemed to flow visibly through the air around her. The old Steinway waited in darkness, its polished surface reflecting the storm's lightning that still flickered outside. As Mrs. Henderson quietly unlocked the music room door, Emma could feel the piano's quantum resonators humming in response to her presence, like an orchestra warming up before a performance. "They're coming," Margaret whispered, her device showing multiple signals converging on their location. "Whatever you're going to do, Emma, it needs to happen now." Emma approached the piano with calm determination. The patterns in her notebook seemed to leap off the page, aligning with the intricate designs carved into the instrument's soundboard. She placed the pocket watch on the music stand, its quantum resonators pulsing in sync with the larger patterns throughout the room. "Dad," she said softly, "do you remember what you always told me about music? How it's not just about playing the right notes, but about feeling the spaces between them?" Jonathan nodded, understanding dawning in his eyes. "How the quantum patterns, they exist in those spaces, don't they?" "Exactly." Emma sat at the piano bench, her fingers hovering over the keys. Alice didn't just see the patterns, she heard them. The quantum network isn't just about protection or communication, it's about harmony, finding the right balance between what we can see and what we can only feel. The security team's footsteps were getting closer. Emma could hear them coordinating their search, their devices beeping with increasing urgency as they detected the growing quantum energy in the music room. But instead of feeling scared, she felt a strange sense of anticipation. Rusty positioned himself by the door, not to guard it, but to welcome what was coming. Mrs. Henderson and Jonathan stood near the windows, while Margaret readied her quantum device, preparing to capture whatever was about to happen. Emma took a deep breath and began to play. The melody started softly, Alice's lullaby, but transformed by Emma's understanding of the quantum patterns. Each note resonated with the designs in her notebook, creating ripples of energy that spread throughout the room. The pocket watch on the music stand began to glow, its resonators amplifying the quantum signatures embedded in the music. As Emma played, something extraordinary happened. The patterns she'd drawn began to lift off the pages of her notebook. Shimmering in the air like auroral lights, they merged with the quantum energy emanating from the piano, creating a visible network of interconnected designs that filled the entire room. The security team burst in, their equipment squealing with feedback, as it encountered energy patterns it couldn't comprehend. But they stopped short at the threshold, transfixed by what they were witnessing. Through her playing, Emma could feel the quantum network coming alive. Each note she struck sent pulses of energy through the patterns, connecting not just to the archive room below, but to every quantum node the Bradfords had established. The house on the outskirts of town, the hidden cellar, the library archive, all resonating in perfect harmony. And then she heard it, another melody, weaving through her own. A piano somewhere else in the network was responding, playing a counterpoint to her song, Alice's music, reaching across the quantum field to complete the symphony they had begun together. Margaret's device lit up with unprecedented readings. "It's happening," she breathed. "The quantum shield, it's not just protecting them anymore, it's growing, adapting, creating new connections." The security team's leader stepped forward, his face a mixture of awe and realization. "All this time," he said quietly, "we were looking for a weapon, a way to control quantum encryption. But this is something else entirely." Emma's fingers continued to dance across the keys, the music flowing through her like a living thing. Through the quantum patterns, she could feel Alice's presence more strongly than ever, not as a distant signal, but as a collaborative partner in this extraordinary performance. "You can't control it?" Emma said, her voice carrying clearly over the music. "That's what the Bradfords discovered. Quantum patterns aren't meant to be weaponized or contained. They're meant to connect, to protect, to bring harmony to discord." The patterns swirling around them had become a visible manifestation of this truth. Where the security team's instruments had tried to capture and analyze the quantum signatures, Emma's music was showing them how to dance with them instead. Rusty's tail wagged in rhythm with the dual melodies. His own connection to the quantum network, evident in the way his fur seemed to shimmer with subtle energy. He had known all along that his job wasn't just to guard the old house, it was to wait for the moment when someone could help complete the symphony the Bradfords had begun. As Emma played the final notes of the lullaby, the quantum patterns reached a crescendo of light and energy. The pocket watch pulsed one final time, and suddenly every quantum node in the network was singing in perfect harmony, a protection system based not on barriers and encryption, but on the fundamental interconnectedness of all things. The security team's leader slowly lowered his equipment, a look of understanding crossing his face. He realized, as everyone in the room did, that they had been witnesses to something far more significant than a technological breakthrough. They had seen the future of protection, one based on harmony rather than control, on understanding rather than force. And somewhere in the quantum network, Alice Bradford was smiling, knowing that her family's legacy was now in exactly the right hands. The days following the quantum symphony brought profound changes to Willow Creek. The security team, led by their chief investigator Thomas Chen, had submitted a detailed report to their corporate headquarters, explaining why the Bradford project should be protected rather than exploited. The quantum network, they argued, represented something far more valuable than a potential weapon. It was a blueprint for a new kind of harmony between technology and human consciousness. Emma sat in her father's study, surrounded by her notebooks and quantum pattern drawings, while Rusty dozed contentedly at her feet. The old dog had finally left his post at the abandoned house. His mission evolved rather than ended. Margaret sat across from them, her quantum device displaying a continuous stream of data from the now fully activated network. "The corporate board has agreed to establish a foundation," Margaret explained, showing Emma a document on her tablet. "The Bradford Wallace Institute for Quantum Harmony. They want you to be part of it, Emma. Your ability to bridge the gap between conventional understanding and quantum perception is unique." Emma's father looked up from his historical records. "They're not just protecting the network, they're funding research to understand it better, but with ethical oversight this time focused on connection rather than control." Mrs. Henderson arrived with a stack of newly discovered documents from the library archives. "Sarah Bradford's research notes are revolutionary," she said, placing them carefully on the desk. She wasn't just studying quantum patterns, she was developing a whole new framework for understanding how consciousness interacts with the quantum field. Emma picked up one of her notebooks, looking at the patterns she'd drawn during the piano performance. They seemed different now, more alive somehow, as if her growing understanding had given them new depth and dimension. "Alice is teaching me," she said softly. "Through the quantum network, she's showing me how to refine my perception. It's like learning a new language, but instead of words, we're using music and patterns. Rusty's ears perked up at the mention of Alice's name. Through the quantum connection, they had learned that the Bradfords were safe, living in a community of others with similar gifts. Alice had found peers who could see the world as she did, and together they were exploring the vast potential of their unique abilities. The house isn't just a safe house anymore, Jonathan observed. It's becoming a sanctuary for others who might have these abilities, a place where they can learn to understand and develop their gifts safely. Margaret nodded. Thomas Chen and his team are helping to convert the corporate security network into a protection system for people with quantum sensitivity. They're calling it Project Harmony, using technology to shield rather than exploit. Emma walked to the study's window, looking out at the autumn leaves dancing in the breeze. She could see the quantum patterns in their movement now, the subtle interactions between wind and matter that created endless symphonies of energy. Alice knew this would happen, she said thoughtfully. That's why she left the trail of clues. She wasn't just trying to protect herself and her family. She was helping to create something larger, something that could change how we think about protection and connection. Mrs. Henderson opened one of the blue-bound books from the archive. The Wallace family's legacy was never just about helping people disappear, she explained. It was about helping them find their true place in the world's greater harmony. Through the quantum network, Emma could feel the resonance of other nodes activating across the country. Each one represented another person, discovering their sensitivity to the patterns, another potential bridge between the conventional world and the quantum realm. The pocket watch, now restored and fully functional, sat on Emma's desk beside her music sheets. It had become both a tool and a symbol, a reminder that time itself was just another pattern in the grand quantum dance of existence. The corporate team has found others like me, Emma shared, excitement coloring her voice. People who can learn to understand the patterns, even if they can't see them naturally like Alice. We're going to help them develop their abilities, teach them how to use music and art to connect with the quantum field. Rusty got up and padded over to Emma, pressing his nose against her hand. Through their shared connection to the network, she could sense his contentment. His role had evolved from guardian to teacher, helping her understand the subtle nuances of quantum perception, just as he had once helped Alice. Margaret's device chimed softly, displaying a new pattern sequence. Alice is reaching out, she said, smiling. She wants to begin the first official lesson. Are you ready, Emma? Emma sat down at the small piano that had been moved into the study. Her fingers hovered over the keys as she felt the quantum patterns gathering around her. This wasn't just about playing music anymore. It was about helping to orchestrate a new kind of harmony, one that could bridge worlds and bring people together in ways never before imagined. As she began to play, the patterns in her notebook started to dance, and somewhere in the quantum network, Alice Bradford began to play along, their melodies intertwining to create something beautiful and new, a symphony of protection, understanding, and hope. 1 year after the Quantum Symphony at the library, Willow Creek had transformed into something extraordinary. The old Bradford house, once abandoned and mysterious, now stood restored to its former glory, its quantum resonators humming with constant activity. The wraparound porch, where Rusty had maintained his faithful vigil, had become a gathering place for young people discovering their own connections to the quantum patterns. Emma sat at the Steinway piano, now relocated to the house's main parlor, teaching a small group of students how to see the music in the quantum field. Rusty lounged nearby. His role evolved from guardian to mentor, helping new arrivals feel comfortable with their emerging abilities. The patterns are always there, Emma explained to a wide-eyed 10-year-old named Maya, who showed particular promise. They're in the way leaves fall, in how birds fly, in the rhythm of rain against windows. The piano just helps us translate what we see into something others can understand. Margaret, now the director of the Bradford Wallace Institute, entered the room carrying a tablet, displaying the latest quantum network readings. We've identified 3 new nodes this month alone, she announced. The harmony is spreading exactly as Alice predicted it would. The Institute had become a beacon of hope for families around the world, discovering their children's unique sensitivities. Instead of hiding these gifts or trying to suppress them, they now had a place where such abilities were understood and celebrated. Thomas Chen, who had transformed from a corporate investigator into one of the Institute's strongest advocates, stood by the window watching new arrivals explore the grounds. It's amazing how fear can turn to understanding when we stop trying to control what we don't understand and start trying to learn from it instead. Emma's father had converted part of the house into a research library, documenting the growing understanding of quantum sensitivity and its implications for human consciousness. Mrs. Henderson split her time between the town library and the Institute, helping to catalogue the expanding collection of quantum-encoded crystal sheets that contained Alice's ongoing teachings. "We received another transmission from Alice this morning," Margaret shared, her eyes bright with excitement. "She's developed a new method for encoding emotional support into the quantum patterns. Imagine being able to send not just information, but actual feelings of comfort and understanding across the network." Emma smiled, remembering how far they'd come from those first mysterious days of watching Rusty guard his post. The dog now lay contentedly at her feet as she began to play Alice's lullaby, its familiar notes carrying new depths of meaning with each performance. Through the quantum connection, she could feel Alice playing along from her own sanctuary, their melodies weaving together across space and time. Other young musicians around the country joined in, each adding their own unique perspective to the growing symphony. The security equipment that had once been meant to capture and control these quantum patterns now served as a protection network, helping to identify and support those with emerging sensitivities. The corporate board had unanimously voted to redirect their resources toward understanding and nurturing these gifts, rather than exploiting them. As twilight approached, Emma walked out onto the porch with Rusty by her side. The quantum patterns were particularly visible at this time of day, dancing like aurora borealis in the space between moments. She could see new students practicing in the garden, their hands moving through the air as they learned to feel the patterns flow. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she said to Rusty, scratching behind his ears. "You weren't just waiting for someone who could see the patterns, you were waiting for someone who could help others learn to see them too." Rusty's gentle woof seemed to agree as he gazed out at the growing community they had helped create. The Bradford house was no longer a place of mystery and secrets, but a home where people could discover their true potential and learn to contribute to the world's greater harmony. Inside, the pocket watch continued its quiet pulse on Emma's desk, its quantum resonators synchronized with similar devices around the world. Each one represented a point of connection in an ever-growing network of understanding and protection. As night fell over Willow Creek, Emma returned to the piano. Her fingers found the keys as naturally as breathing, and the quantum patterns rose around her like a visible manifestation of hope. She began to play a new melody, not just Alice's lullaby, but a composition of her own, one that spoke of mystery solved, of fears transformed into understanding, and of the endless possibilities that arise when we learn to see the world through new eyes. Somewhere in the quantum network, Alice Bradford was smiling, knowing that her family's legacy had become something far greater than they had ever imagined, a symphony of protection that would continue to grow and evolve, connecting hearts and minds across generations, teaching the world that the greatest mysteries often lead to the most beautiful truths. As the music filled the house, Emma knew that this was just the beginning. The quantum patterns would continue to reveal their secrets to those willing to listen and learn, creating an eternal symphony of understanding that would resonate through time, bringing harmony to a world that increasingly needed it. And Rusty, the faithful guardian whose vigil had started it all, rested peacefully by the piano, knowing that his mission hadn't ended. It had evolved into something eternal and ever-growing, just like the quantum patterns themselves. Dear listeners, we hope you've been moved by the extraordinary tale of Emma, Rusty, and the quantum symphony that changed Willow Creek forever. This story reminds us that the greatest mysteries in life often lead us to the most beautiful discoveries about ourselves and our connection to others. If this journey through quantum patterns and musical harmony has touched your heart, we invite you to join our growing community. Subscribe to our channel for more enchanting stories that explore the magical intersection of science, art, and human consciousness. Leave a like if you believe in the power of seeing the world differently, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember, like the quantum patterns in our story, every perspective adds to the greater harmony of our shared experience. We'll be back soon with more tales that challenge our understanding and expand our hearts. Until then, may you find your own patterns of wonder in the world around you.